Okay, so get this. In Botswana, the government's declared a severe drought
Oh, wow.
in a region that's home to thousands of San people.
Right.
And you'd think, okay, so their focus should be on getting aid to these communities, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, they're allowing a company called Recon Africa to explore for oil there.
Hmm. That's alarming.
Yeah.
The potential for conflict there.
Yeah.
Drought often leads to competition for resources and livelihoods.
Yeah.
These sand communities could be pushed further into vulnerability if oil exploration takes precedence over their needs.
It's just one of the shocking stories that we're going to unpack today as we take a deep dive into Indigenous people's rights around the globe in 2023.
Yeah.
Our main source, the Indigenous World 2024 report from IWGIA.
This report, it really underscores that indigenous peoples are facing increasing pressure on their lands and resources,
Yeah.
but it also shows their remarkable resilience and advocating for their rights and protecting their cultures.
I went into this thinking it would be all doom and gloom, but there are some real wins in here, too.
Oh, absolutely.
For example, the report talks about how several native tribes in the United States regained control of their ancestral lands.
These land return wins are part of a growing global movement. So we're calling it the land back movement. And it's not just about the land itself, though.
Okay.
It's about self-determination, cultural revitalization, and having a say in how those lands are managed.
It's like returning a piece of someone's history, their soul almost.
Hmm.
Speaking of land and its deep connection to indigenous cultures, the report really hammers home that land rights are the bedrock of indigenous people's rights.
Yeah, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples recognizes this. It basically says that for indigenous peoples, land isn't just property. It's tied to their history, their spirituality, their very identity.
It makes you realize that displacing someone from their ancestral land isn't just taking away their house, it's taking away a fundamental part of who they are. And this connection between land and identity becomes even more crucial when we look at climate change.
Yeah, indigenous peoples are often on the front lines of climate change impacts, especially those living in fragile ecosystems like rainforests.
Right.
The report mentions the devastating forest fires in Bolivia,
Yeah.
which hit indigenous territories particularly hard.
Reading about those fires really drove home the point that protecting indigenous land rights is also about protecting the environment.
Right, indigenous peoples are often the best stewards of their lands,
Yeah.
with a deep understanding of sustainable resource management. And this brings us to a really critical tension highlighted in the report, the global push for renewable energy.
Oh, right. The whole green energy transition. I can see where this is going.
Exactly. Well, the transition to clean energy is crucial.
Yeah.
The report shows how the rush for minerals needed for these technologies can end up violating indigenous land rights.
So basically, we could end up creating one problem while trying to solve another.
The report stresses the importance of free, prior, and informed consent,
Right.
FPIC,
Yeah.
in any projects affecting indigenous lands. It's about ensuring that they have a say in what happens on their territories, and that they benefit from any development, not just corporations.
It's about respecting their right to self-determination, not just paying lip service to it.
Absolutely.
It feels like a recurring theme. Good intentions, but maybe not always good execution.
Absolutely. And speaking of good intentions, the report does highlight some positive political shifts. Take Brazil, for example.
Yeah.
After years of policies harmful to both indigenous peoples and the environment, they've established a new Ministry of Indigenous Peoples.
I read about that, and they appointed Joino Wapichana, the first Indigenous woman lawyer, to head FUNAI, their Agency for Indigenous Affairs. That feels like a huge symbolic step.
It is. It signals a potential change in direction for Brazil, although it remains to be seen how these changes translate into concrete actions on the ground.
I guess actions speak louder than words, right? But still, it's encouraging to see some governments acknowledging the need to do better. And it's not just Brazil. The report mentions positive legal developments in countries like Laos, the DRC, Mexico, Chile, and Canada.
In Laos, for instance, they've introduced this concept of guardian villages. Pretty cool, right?
Wait, so it's like they're literally guardians of the forest.
It's where indigenous communities co-manage protected areas and participate in resource use decisions.
That's awesome.
All right.
Are they given any special training or resources for this?
That's where the report can delve a bit deeper.
Okay.
We see these glimmers of hope,
Yeah.
but it would be great to know how successful these initiatives actually are. What can other countries learn from them?
Good point. We need to go beyond just noting these initiatives and really understand how they're playing out in reality.
Exactly. And while these examples show growing recognition of Indigenous peoples' roles in conservation and sustainable resource management, the report cautions us that legal recognition is only a first step. Implementation and enforcement are just as crucial.
Which brings us back to that situation in Botswana. It's a prime example of how laws on paper don't always translate to protection on the ground.
Right. It raises a crucial question. How do we ensure that legal advancements actually lead to tangible change? Accountability both for governments and corporations is paramount.
I'm getting the sense that this whole issue is a lot more nuanced than I initially thought. I'm already starting to see those layers of complexity the critique talked about.
It definitely is. And we're just scratching the surface here. There are so many more stories to uncover, both inspiring and concerning. Ready to dive deeper.
Absolutely. When we talk about accountability, it's impossible to ignore the role of corporations.
Yeah.
The report highlights this really unsettling trend of greenwashing.
Yes,
Right.
where companies use eco-friendly language
Right.
to mask practices that actually harm Indigenous communities and their lands.
Exactly. It's like putting a green bandage on a gaping wound.
Right.
A good example is what's happening in Kenya.
Yeah.
The reports mentions how the government is promoting climate-smart agriculture,
Right.
but there are concerns that this could lead to even more land being taken away from Indigenous communities.
So who benefits from these so-called sustainable initiatives?
Yeah.
Are they genuinely designed to protect the environment and Indigenous livelihoods, or are they just a way for corporations to profit under the guise of sustainability?
It makes you really question the motives behind these projects,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not just corporations, right?
Right.
Governments play a huge role, too.
Absolutely.
In Tanzania, for instance, they don't even officially recognize any Indigenous peoples,
Wow.
despite having distinct groups like the Maasai and the Hadzabe.
The lack of recognition is a huge problem.
Yeah.
It makes these communities practically invisible in the eyes of the law, which means they have a much harder time accessing rights and protections.
So it's like they're being denied their very existence. It's no wonder the report talks about their increasing marginalization, especially with policies that prioritize development over their land rights and cultural integrity.
Exactly. It's a reminder that progress isn't a straight line. While some countries are taking positive steps, others are moving in the opposite direction, ignoring the rights of their Indigenous populations.
And sometimes it's not just about ignoring rights, it's about actively suppressing them. This report details some truly disturbing situations like in Eritrea, where the government is engaging in what the UN has called potential ethnic cleansing.
The situation in Eritrea is incredibly concerning.
Yeah.
The report mentions how the government is suppressing Indigenous cultures and economies. And what makes it even harder to address is that Eritrea is notorious for its tight control over information.
So getting accurate information out is a huge challenge, let alone holding the government accountable or mobilizing international pressure.
What?
It feels like a forgotten crisis.
It highlights the crucial role of organizations like IWGIA in documenting these situations and bringing them to the world's attention.
Yeah,
Without their work, these stories might remain hidden.
absolutely. It emphasizes the power of raising awareness, of making sure these issues don't fade into the background. And it's not just about highlighting problems, it's about showcasing solutions and resilience, too.
Right. The report features a lot of examples of Indigenous communities taking initiative and achieving victories. For example, in Namibia, they held their first Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities Conservation Congress.
What exactly did they achieve at this Congress? Was it just talk, or did it actually lead to concrete actions?
That's where the report could provide more detail.
Okay.
It mentions that the goal was to bolster community-led governance and conservation. But we need to know what specific outcomes emerged from the Congress.
Right.
Did they implement new policies? Did they secure funding for community-led conservation initiatives?
It's like, give us the after picture. Show us how these gatherings translate into real-world changes. But speaking of positive action, the report does highlight some impressive legal developments in countries like Algeria.
Okay.
The UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Peaceful Assembly and Association expressed concern about overly restrictive laws affecting the right to association. The report goes on to explain how these laws are impacting the Amazigh or Berber people.
Okay.
They're being targeted for expressing their culture and identity, even facing arrest for displaying the Amazigh flag.
Wow.
Wait, they can be arrested for displaying their own flag.
That's a stark reminder that laws can be used to protect rights or to suppress them. We need to be vigilant about how these laws are implemented and enforced and whether they uphold international human rights standards.
It makes you wonder if there are similar situations happening elsewhere that we're not even aware of.
Absolutely. The report encourages us to think critically about these legal frameworks and to advocate for their alignment with Indigenous peoples' rights. But it also reminds us that laws are just one part of the equation. We need to look at the broader context, the social and political dynamics that shape the reality on the ground.
Like in Tunisia, where the government is pushing for private investments in renewable energy projects on indigenous lands.
Yes, and often without proper consultation or consent, according to the report.
Great.
It seems like a classic case of the rush for green energy overriding the rights of indigenous communities.
It feels like we're seeing this pattern emerge, this tension between global initiatives for sustainability and the rights of indigenous peoples. It's like we're so focused on the destination that we're forgetting about the people we might be leaving behind on the journey.
And that brings us to the crucial role of international organizations in advancing indigenous peoples' rights.
Okay.
The report mentions the Arctic Council, ASEAN, and the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues as key platforms for advocacy and collaboration.
Right. And it's not just about organizations, it's about the indigenous peoples themselves taking a seat at the table. I was really impressed by the work of the Global Indigenous Peoples Caucus at the UN Business and Human Rights Forum.
Their advocacy for stronger protections against the criminalization of indigenous peoples' resistance to corporate projects is vital. We've seen countless instances of indigenous activists being targeted, harassed, and even killed for defending their lands and rights.
It's a dangerous and often deadly fight. Their courage is remarkable. It makes you realize how much we take for granted in our comfortable lives.
Exactly. International solidarity and support are crucial. Their fight is our fight, and we need to amplify their voices and hold corporations and governments accountable.
I'm also curious about the role of women in all of this. Are they equally represented in these forums and movements?
That's a great question, and one that the report addresses directly. It highlights the unique challenges faced by Indigenous women and girls who often face intersecting forms of discrimination and violence.
I remember reading about the alarming rates of violence against Indigenous women in Cameroon. It was truly heartbreaking.
It's a stark reminder of the systemic inequalities that persist. But amidst these challenges, the report also highlights the leadership and activism of Indigenous women. Figures like Nyan Parmo in Kenya, who's promoting sustainable forest management, embody their strength and resilience.
It feels like they're carrying a double burden, fighting for their community's rights while also facing specific threats because of their gender.
Their voices are essential in shaping a more just and equitable future for Indigenous peoples. The report underscores the importance of addressing gender-specific issues and empowering Indigenous women as leaders and decision-makers.
You know, hearing about all these diverse situations around the world makes me wonder what's happening closer to home. Are there similar issues affecting Indigenous peoples in my own region? I'm realizing how little I actually know.
That's a common realization for many people. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the issue. But the report encourages us to start locally. Learn about the Indigenous peoples in your area, their history, their current struggles, and how you can support their initiatives.
That's a great point. Knowledge is power, right? The more we understand, the more effective we can be in our actions. And I'm guessing the report provides some resources for where to start.
Absolutely. It mentions resources like the Indigenous Navigator, which is a fantastic tool for finding information about Indigenous peoples worldwide, and the IWGIA website, which provides in-depth reports and analysis.
So it's not just about raising awareness, it's about giving people the tools to actually do something. That's really empowering. I'm feeling a lot more informed and honestly a lot more motivated to take action.
And that's where the power of individual action comes in. You know, we often hear about these large-scale issues,
Right.
but it's easy to feel powerless.
Yeah.
The report reminds us that change starts with each of us.
So it's not just about donating to big international organizations.
Not at all. There are so many ways to get involved.
Okay.
Supporting Indigenous-led organizations working in your region, learning about the history of Indigenous peoples in your area, advocating for policy changes. These are all meaningful actions.
I'm starting to see how this all ties back to the listener critique.
Right.
They wanted more than just a summary. They wanted takeaways, things they could actually do.
Precisely. This deep dive isn't just about filling your brain with facts. It's about sparking action, igniting that passion for change. And speaking of taking action, the report highlights some inspiring examples of Indigenous-led resistance. In Guatemala, for instance, communities are actively reclaiming land stolen from them during the country's civil war.
Wow, that must be an incredibly difficult battle, especially against powerful economic interests.
Right.
What's fueling their determination to reclaim what was lost?
It's about justice. It's about healing. It's about reclaiming their heritage. And it's not just about the past, it's about shaping their future. These land reclamations are often tied to cultural revitalization and sustainable resource management.
It's like they're reclaiming not just their land, but their identity, their power. It's a reminder that even in the face of immense challenges, Indigenous peoples are not giving up. They're fighting back, and they're winning.
And their victories are our victories. Their fight for justice and self-determination benefits all of us. It's about protecting biodiversity. It's about addressing climate change. It's about building a more just and equitable world.
Okay, I have to ask, what about international collaborations? Is anyone helping with these efforts?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The report dedicates a whole section to the work of international organizations like the Arctic Council and ASEAN.
Okay.
The Arctic Council, for example, is focused on addressing climate change and its impacts on indigenous peoples in the Arctic.
That makes sense considering the Arctic is warming at an alarming rate. Are there any specific initiatives you found particularly noteworthy?
Well, they've been paying a lot of attention to wildland fires,
Okay.
which are becoming more frequent and intense due to climate change.
Right.
These fires pose a huge threat to indigenous communities and ecosystems in the Arctic.
It's a reminder of the interconnectedness of climate change and Indigenous rights. It's not just an environmental issue, it's a human rights issue.
Exactly. And it requires collaborative solutions. The report also highlights the work of ASEAN in developing guidelines for recognizing customary tenure in forested landscapes.
Mm.
This is a big step towards securing indigenous people's land rights in Southeast Asia.
It's encouraging to see regional organizations taking concrete steps to address these issues. It shows a growing recognition of Indigenous people's rights and their role in environmental stewardship.
And it's not just regional organizations. The UN is playing a key role, too.
Right.
The report talks about the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and their efforts to include indigenous peoples in climate action.
So Indigenous peoples are finally getting a seat at the table in these global climate discussions.
Yes, and they're making their voices heard.
At KP28, they successfully advocated for their distinct recognition separate from local communities in the global stocktake decision text. This ensures their unique rights and needs are specifically addressed. That's a huge win. It shows the power of Indigenous advocacy on a global stage. It also makes me think about funding. Are there any mechanisms in place to support Indigenous-led climate initiatives?
The Green Climate Fund is one example mentioned in the report. They're working to support climate change mitigation and adaptation projects led by indigenous communities. They even have an indigenous peoples policy that emphasizes free, prior, and informed consent and full participation in decision-making.
That's reassuring. It's important to ensure that climate funding actually reaches Indigenous communities and that they have control over how it's used. But beyond climate change, what about support for broader Indigenous-led development initiatives?
The report highlights the work of the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFD.
Okay.
They have an Indigenous Peoples Forum that promotes dialogue between Indigenous representatives, IFA, and governments.
So it's like creating a space for open conversation and collaboration. What kind of outcomes have come from this forum?
They've established the Indigenous Peoples Assistance Facility, IPAF, which provides financial support to Indigenous peoples organizations and projects. It's all about empowering communities to drive their own development.
It's inspiring to see these concrete mechanisms in place to support Indigenous-led initiatives. It feels like we're moving beyond just acknowledging the problems and actually taking steps towards solutions. But what about addressing the root causes of these issues, like discrimination and historical injustices?
The UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is a key platform for tackling these larger systemic issues. The report details the discussions from their 22nd session, which focused on themes like human rights, economic development, and cultural heritage.
It's interesting that they also address the challenges faced by Indigenous persons with disabilities. It shows a growing understanding of the intersectionality of Indigenous rights and other human rights issues.
Absolutely. The forum also highlighted the role of the Indigenous Navigator in supporting self-determined development and monitoring the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's all about empowering communities to hold states accountable.
It sounds like there are a lot of moving parts, a lot of different actors working on this issue at various levels.
It's a complex landscape for sure. But the key takeaway from the report is that progress is being made. Indigenous peoples are gaining recognition, raising their voices, and shaping their own futures.
It's a reminder that even in the face of immense challenges, there is hope. The strength and resilience of Indigenous peoples, their deep connection to their lands and cultures, and the growing global movement in support of their rights all point towards a future where their voices are heard, their rights are respected, and their cultures thrive.
So to our listener, we encourage you to reflect on what you've learned today. What surprised you? What sparked your curiosity? What action will you take, however small, to contribute to a more just and equitable world for Indigenous peoples.
This deep dive has been an eye-opening journey, and we hope it's just the beginning of a lifelong commitment to learning, understanding, and taking action. Thanks for joining us at